Robert wakes up before the sun rises. Not because he wants to, because he has to. The alarm clock beside his bed reads 5:27 a.m., 3 minutes before it rings. At 70 years old, his body no longer waits for alarms. Sleep comes in short fragments now. 2 hours here, maybe 1 hour there. He sits up slowly on the edge of the bed. For a moment, he doesn't move. His knees ache. His back feels stiff. His hands are slightly numb from the cold morning air that seeps through the thin window of his small apartment. Robert takes a deep breath and rubs his face. Another day. Another shift. Another reminder that retirement never really arrived. On the chair next to his bed hangs a faded blue polo shirt with the logo of a grocery store stitched on the chest. The threads around the logo are starting to loosen. The collar has been washed so many times it barely holds its shape anymore. He pulls it on anyway. At 70 years old, Robert is still working. Not because he enjoys it, not because he's trying to stay busy, but because he has no savings. None. No retirement account. No investment portfolio. No pension. Just a monthly Social Security check that barely covers his rent. And the quiet, uncomfortable truth is this. Robert's story is not unusual. In fact, millions of Americans are walking the exact same path right now. People who spent 40, sometimes 50 years working. People who did everything they believed they were supposed to do. And yet today, in their 70s, they are still waking up before sunrise to go to work. Robert walks into his tiny kitchen and opens the refrigerator. Inside there are only a few things. A half loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter, a carton of eggs, and a bottle of generic orange juice. He makes the same breakfast he has eaten almost every morning for the past 3 years. 2 pieces of toast, 1 fried egg, black coffee, no sugar, no cream. He eats quietly at a small table beside the window while the sky slowly turns gray outside. The city is still mostly asleep, but in a few minutes, Robert will leave the apartment and begin the same routine he has followed for the past 3 years. Bus, shift, bus home, sleep, repeat. Because 3 years ago, at the age of 67, Robert realized something that terrified him. He could not afford to retire. After 45 years of working, the number in his bank account was shockingly small. $1,700,000. That was everything. His entire financial safety net. 45 years of labor reduced to a number that wouldn't even cover 3 months of rent. And when Robert saw that number, something inside him went very quiet. Not anger, not panic. Just a slow, heavy realization. The plan had failed. But the strange thing is, Robert never thought he was making bad financial decisions. In fact, most of his life looked very ordinary, very responsible, very normal. Robert was born in 1,955 inches, a small town in Ohio. His father worked in a steel plant. His mother worked part-time at a diner. They were not wealthy people, but they lived by a simple belief that defined an entire generation. If you work hard, you'll be okay. Robert believed that. Almost everyone around him believed that. After graduating high school, he didn't go to college. Instead, he took a job at a local warehouse, loading trucks. It was physically demanding work, but the pay was decent for a young man with no degree. By the time he turned 25, he was earning about $14 an hour, which at the time felt like a solid living. He got married at 27. His wife, Linda, worked as a dental assistant. Together they saved enough for a down payment on a small 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't a big house, but it was theirs. They painted the living room together one weekend, planted flowers in the front yard, hung family photos on the walls. For a while, life felt stable, predictable, safe. Robert worked overtime whenever he could, 50 hours a week, sometimes 60. He rarely complained, because every paycheck felt like progress. Every year, the mortgage balance got a little smaller. Every year, his children got a little older. And every year, Robert believed he was building something permanent, something that would eventually lead to a comfortable retirement. But life has a way of quietly rewriting plans. When Robert was 42 years old, something happened that changed everything. One morning, workers at the warehouse were called into the break room. The manager stood in front of them, holding a sheet of paper. He looked nervous. The room was silent. And then he said the words no worker ever wants to hear. The company is shutting down this location. Just like that. No warning. No transition period. 200 workers lost their jobs in a single afternoon. Robert drove home that day in complete silence. His mind was racing, but he didn't know what to say. When he walked into the kitchen, Linda immediately knew something was wrong. What happened? Robert sat down at the table. They closed the warehouse. And for the first time in his adult life, Robert didn't know what came next. For the next 8 months, he searched for work. Every day, applications, phone calls, interviews. But something had changed in the job market. The kinds of stable, long-term positions he once relied on were disappearing. Most of the offers he received paid far less than his previous job. Eventually, he accepted a position at another distribution center. The pay was $18 an hour, $10 less than what he had been earning before. At first, Robert told himself it was temporary, just a short setback. He believed things would recover, but the truth was harder to accept. They never did. From that point forward, the financial pressure slowly began to grow. Groceries got more expensive. Healthcare costs crept higher every year. Car repairs came at the worst possible times. And whenever an unexpected bill appeared, Robert dipped into the savings account. At first, it was small withdrawals. $500. $1,000. Then more. When Linda needed surgery for a knee injury, the hospital bills wiped out nearly half of what they had saved. Robert told himself the same thing many people say during difficult moments. We'll rebuild it later. But later kept moving further away. Years passed. His children went to college. Robert helped them with tuition whenever he could. Not because he had extra money, but because he wanted them to have opportunities he never had. By the time Robert turned 58, something strange had happened. He had worked almost his entire life, and yet the savings account never seemed to grow again. It just stayed small, fragile, vulnerable to the next unexpected expense. And then 2008 arrived. The financial crisis hit the country like a shockwave. Home values collapsed. Retirement accounts across the country lost massive value. Businesses cut hours. Some shut down completely. Robert watched neighbors lose their homes. Friends lost jobs they had held for decades. And slowly, a quiet fear began spreading among workers his age. A question nobody wanted to say out loud. What if we can't afford to stop working? Robert pushed the thought away. He still believed there was time. Still believed he could catch up. But time moves faster in your 60s than it ever did in your 30s. And before he fully realized what was happening, retirement age had arrived. And the numbers didn't work. At 65, Robert sat down at the same kitchen table where he had eaten breakfast for decades. He opened his bank account on an old laptop, and he stared at the screen. The number didn't look real. 1,740 yuan. 45 years of work, and that was all that remained. For a long time, he just sat there, not speaking, not moving, because in that moment, Robert understood something many Americans are slowly beginning to realize. Working hard is no longer a guarantee of financial security, and retirement is no longer guaranteed. For several weeks after seeing that number, Robert avoided thinking about the future. He still woke up early, still drank his coffee at the kitchen table, still watched the morning news. But something had changed in the way he looked at the world. The word retirement suddenly felt unrealistic, almost like a luxury meant for someone else. Someone luckier, someone richer. Robert began doing something he had never done before. He started calculating. If his Social Security payment was around $1,350 a month, and his rent alone was $950, that left just $400 for everything else. Electricity, food, transportation, medication, unexpected bills. The math didn't work. Not even close. At first, Robert considered downsizing to a cheaper place. But rent prices had changed dramatically over the years. Even the smallest studio apartments in his area were still over $800 a month. And moving meant deposits, moving trucks, and expenses he simply couldn't afford. So, one afternoon, sitting quietly at his kitchen table, Robert made a decision. He would go back to work. At 67 years old, the strange part was how quickly reality responded. Within a few weeks, Robert began noticing something he had never paid attention to before. Older workers. Everywhere. At the grocery store checkout counter. At the pharmacy. At the hardware store. At the front entrance of big retail chains greeting customers. Gray hair. Wrinkled hands. Slow, careful movements. People well into their 60s and 70s, still wearing employee name tags. Robert realized something that both comforted and worried him at the same time. He wasn't the only one. One morning, he walked into a grocery store near his apartment and noticed a sign near the entrance. Now, hiring. Flexible hours. He stood there for a moment, staring at it. Then he walked inside and asked to speak with the manager. The interview lasted less than 10 minutes. The manager looked at Robert's age on the application and asked a simple question. "Are you okay standing for long periods of time?" Robert nodded. The manager smiled politely. "Great. We could use someone at the front door greeting customers." The pay was $12.50 an hour. Not much, but enough to make the math work. Enough to survive. And just like that, Robert became one of the millions of older Americans quietly returning to the workforce. His first shift felt strange. Standing at the entrance, watching customers push shopping carts past him, most of them younger, busy, focused on their phones. Some smiled and said hello. Most walked past without noticing him at all. Robert didn't take it personally. He understood. Life moves fast when you're younger. People are rushing to jobs, rushing to pick up kids, rushing to get through another day. They rarely stop to look closely at the people around them. But Robert noticed something they probably didn't. More and more of his coworkers were close to his age. A woman named Carol worked the checkout counter. She was 72. A man named James collected shopping carts from the parking lot. He was 68. Another employee in the produce section was 75. 75 years old and still lifting boxes of fruit every morning. One day, during a lunch break, Robert asked James a question. "Did you ever plan to retire?" James laughed. Not a bitter laugh. More like the laugh of someone who had accepted a difficult truth. "I thought I would," he said. Then he shrugged. Life had other plans. That short conversation stayed with Robert, because it perfectly described what had happened to so many people. Life had other plans. When economists study retirement in America today, they often talk about numbers, savings rates, retirement accounts, investment returns. But those numbers rarely tell the full story, because behind every statistic is a life filled with unpredictable events. Layoffs, medical bills, divorce, family emergencies, economic crises, and each one chips away at the financial stability people spend decades trying to build. In the past, many workers relied on pensions. Companies promised steady income after retirement. If you worked there long enough, you were taken care of. But over the last 40 years, those pensions slowly disappeared. They were replaced by retirement accounts like 401ks, accounts that depend entirely on how much a worker can afford to save. And that's where the system began to change. Because saving money sounds simple, until you look at the reality of everyday life, when rent takes half your paycheck, when healthcare premiums rise every year, when groceries cost more than they did just 12 months ago, saving for retirement becomes something people postpone. Next year I'll start, once things stabilize, after the kids finish school. But years pass quickly, and suddenly people find themselves in their 60s, wondering where the time went. One evening after work, Robert rode the bus home with sore feet and aching knees. The bus was half empty. Streetlights blurred past the window as the city moved quietly through the night. Robert leaned his head against the glass and thought about something he hadn't considered in a long time. How did 70 years go by so fast? It didn't feel like that long ago he was teaching his son how to ride a bicycle, or helping his daughter with homework at the kitchen table. Those memories felt close, but the calendar said otherwise. 70 years. And still working. Still waking up before sunrise. Still depending on every paycheck. For many older Americans, this is the part of retirement nobody talks about. The physical toll. Standing all day when your joints ache. Smiling politely when your back hurts. pretending everything is fine even when exhaustion builds slowly week after week. Robert never complains. But sometimes, at the end of a long shift, he sits quietly on the bus and massages his knees with his hands. Small movements, careful pressure, trying to ease the stiffness before tomorrow's shift begins again. Because tomorrow will be the same. Wake up early, coffee, bus, work, bus home, sleep, and repeat. And as Robert slowly realized, this cycle might continue for the rest of his life. Not because he failed, not because he was irresponsible, but because the world he grew up believing in had quietly changed. And millions of Americans are only beginning to understand what that change really means. For a long time, Robert avoided talking about money, not because he didn't understand it, but because the subject carried a quiet sense of shame. When people imagine someone reaching 70 with no savings, they often picture reckless decisions, gambling, luxury spending, irresponsibility. But Robert's life never looked like that. His life looked ordinary. And that is exactly what makes this story so unsettling. Because Robert did what millions of Americans have done for generations. He worked. For decades. He paid his taxes. He raised children. He tried to save whenever he could. Yet somehow, it still wasn't enough. One evening after work, Robert sat in his living room watching television while eating a simple dinner, macaroni and canned soup. The news anchor on the screen was talking about retirement statistics. Robert wasn't really paying attention until he heard one sentence that made him look up. Nearly half of Americans approaching retirement age have little to no savings. Half. Robert leaned back in his chair and stared at the screen. Half of the country. That meant millions of people were standing exactly where he was standing, trying to figure out how to survive the final decades of life without the financial cushion they once believed they would have. And the deeper researchers look into the issue, the more complicated the picture becomes. Because retirement in America has quietly transformed over the past 50 years. In the 1970s, many companies offered pensions. Workers who stayed loyal to a company could expect steady income for the rest of their lives after retirement. It was not perfect, but it created a level of security that allowed people to imagine a future where work eventually ended. That system slowly began to disappear in the 1980s and 1990s. Companies replaced pensions with 401 clash retirement accounts. On the surface, it sounded like a modern improvement. Workers could invest their money, grow their wealth, take control of their financial future. But there was one major difference. The responsibility shifted. Instead of companies guaranteeing retirement income, individuals were now responsible for building their own financial safety net. And that sounds reasonable, until you look at the reality many workers face. Because saving money requires one simple thing: extra money. And for millions of households, that extra money never really existed. In the past 20 years, the cost of living has climbed dramatically. Housing prices, healthcare costs, childcare, education, groceries. Every year those expenses quietly rise. Meanwhile, wages for many workers have barely kept pace. So people do what they have always done. They focus on surviving the present. They tell themselves they will save later. Next year, after the next raise, after things stabilize. But life rarely stabilizes. There is always another bill, another emergency, another unexpected expense. For Robert, those moments came again and again. A broken transmission in his car, medical bills when Linda needed surgery, helping his daughter pay for textbooks in college, then helping his son when he lost his job during a recession. Each event seemed temporary, manageable, but together they slowly drained the savings he had worked so hard to build. Looking back now, Robert sometimes wonders if things could have been different. Maybe he could have invested earlier. Maybe he could have saved more aggressively. Maybe he could have made different decisions. But hindsight is always clearer than reality. When you are raising children and paying bills, long-term planning often takes a back seat to immediate survival. And by the time many people realize how important retirement savings truly are, time has already moved forward. The years that matter most for compound growth are gone. One afternoon, during his shift at the grocery store, Robert noticed something unusual. A young customer had stopped near the entrance, scrolling through his phone. The man looked frustrated. After a moment, he sighed and said something quietly to himself. "I can't believe rent went up again." Robert heard the comment and smiled politely. Not because it was funny, but because it sounded familiar. That same frustration has echoed through generations. Rising costs, financial pressure, the feeling that stability is always just slightly out of reach. The young man eventually walked inside the store and disappeared down the aisles. But Robert kept thinking about him, because in that moment, he saw a reflection of his younger self. A man in his 20s trying to build a life in a world that seemed increasingly expensive. Robert wondered something he had never asked before. How many people that age were saving for retirement? How many even believed retirement would be possible? Because the reality is this: the retirement crisis in America doesn't begin at 70. It begins much earlier. In your 30s, your 40s, sometimes even your 20s. Every year that passes without savings quietly shapes the future. And many people don't notice until the timeline becomes very short. By the time Robert turned 65, the window for recovery had almost closed. Investment growth requires time, sometimes decades. Without those decades, even disciplined saving struggles to catch up. That is why many Americans today are facing a difficult truth. Working longer is becoming the new retirement plan. Instead of retiring at 65, many people now expect to work until 70, or 75, or as long as their bodies allow. And for some, that works. They remain healthy, energetic, able to continue. But for others, the situation becomes far more fragile, because aging does not move at the same speed for everyone. Some people develop health problems. Some lose mobility. Some simply become too exhausted to continue working full-time. And that is where the real fear begins. What happens when someone cannot work anymore, but also cannot afford to stop? That question sits quietly in the back of Robert's mind. He doesn't talk about it. He doesn't share it with coworkers. But sometimes, late at night, when the apartment is silent, the thought appears. What happens if my body gives out? What happens if I can't stand at that grocery store door anymore? Because, unlike earlier generations, Robert does not have a pension waiting. He does not have a large retirement account to rely on. He has Social Security, and whatever paychecks he can still earn. For now, that is enough to keep the lights on, enough to buy groceries, enough to survive another month. But survival and security are not the same thing, and Robert understands that difference better than most. Late one night, Robert sat alone in his apartment after finishing another shift. The television was on, but the volume was low. He wasn't really watching it. The light from the screen flickered across the room while he stared quietly at the floor. His feet were sore, his back ached, the kind of tired that doesn't disappear after one night of sleep. He leaned back in his chair and slowly rubbed his hands together. 70 years old, still working. And the truth is, Robert doesn't think about retirement anymore. Not the way people imagine it. There are no dreams of long vacations. No plans to travel across the country. No quiet mornings on a beach somewhere warm. Those images belong to a different version of life. A version that slowly slipped away over time. Instead, Robert focuses on something much simpler. Getting through the next month. Making sure the rent is paid. Making sure there's food in the refrigerator. Making sure the lights stay on. For millions of Americans his age, this has quietly become the reality of retirement. Not rest. Not freedom. Just survival. Economists sometimes call it a retirement gap. The difference between what people need to retire comfortably and what they actually have saved. And that gap is growing. Today, many financial experts estimate that a typical American household needs hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes even over $1 million, to retire without financial stress. But the median retirement savings for many older Americans is far lower. In some cases, close to zero. That gap forces people into difficult choices. Some delay retirement for as long as possible. Some take part-time jobs just to cover basic expenses. Some move in with family members because housing costs are too high. Others simply reduce their lives to the bare minimum. Fewer doctor visits, smaller grocery bills, less heating during winter. Robert has seen all of these choices among people he knows. Carol, the 72-year-old cashier at the grocery store, works 6 days a week. James, the man who collects shopping carts, takes pain medication just to get through his shift. Another coworker recently quit because her arthritis became too painful to continue. No celebration, no farewell party, just a quiet goodbye. One day, she was there. The next day, she wasn't. And no one knew what happened after that. These stories rarely make the news. They happen quietly, one person at a time. But together they reveal something important about the way life has changed. For much of the 20th century, retirement was seen as a reward, a final chapter where people could finally slow down after decades of work. But today, that chapter looks very different for many Americans. Instead of a finish line, it has become an extension of the race. Work simply continues, longer, later into life, sometimes, until the body simply refuses to cooperate anymore. Robert tries not to dwell on that possibility. He focuses on small routines that keep his days structured. Wake up, coffee, bus, work, bus home, dinner, sleep. It may not be glamorous, but it provides something important: stability. And stability, at this stage of life, means everything. Sometimes customers stop and talk with him at the store entrance. A few ask how long he has been working there. When he tells them he started at 67, many react with surprise. "You don't look 70, they say politely. Robert usually smiles. "Thank you," he replies. But inside, he knows the truth. His body feels 70, maybe older. Still, he keeps showing up. Because showing up is the only option he has. And in many ways, Robert represents something larger than his own story. He represents a quiet warning, not a dramatic one, not the kind shouted in headlines, but a slow, uncomfortable reality that millions of people are beginning to confront. Time moves quickly, much faster than most people expect. The decades that seem distant when you are young arrive sooner than you imagine. And financial security in old age does not happen automatically. It must be built slowly, year after year, sometimes through sacrifices that feel unnecessary in the moment, but become critical later. One evening, while riding the bus home after work, Robert watched the city lights passing outside the window. Young people filled the sidewalks. Restaurants were busy. Cars rushed through intersections. Life moving forward at full speed. He wondered how many of those people had thought about their future. How many believed retirement would simply happen one day, the way he once believed. The bus slowed to a stop near his apartment building. Robert stood up carefully, steadying himself on the metal pole as the doors opened. Cool night air filled the bus. He stepped outside and began the slow walk toward his building. Tomorrow morning, the alarm clock would ring again. 5 to 3 a.m. Another shift. Another day. But as Robert unlocked the door to his apartment, one thought quietly crossed his mind. Not regret, not bitterness, just a simple realization. 70 years can pass faster than anyone expects. And the decisions made decades earlier often shape the final chapters of life in ways people never fully see coming. Because the hardest part of Robert's story isn't that he's still working. It's that he never imagined he would have to. And tonight, across America, millions of people are going to sleep, believing the same thing, believing there will always be more time, more chances, more years to prepare. But time has a way of moving quietly, and before anyone notices, the future eventually becomes the present. And the question that once felt distant suddenly becomes very real. What will life look like when you reach 70?